What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Primetime Sports Podcast, hosted by Joey Maylari. So in today's episode, I'm going to talk about some headlines in the MLB from the last week, and then I will also talk about some NBA trades that have gone down over the last couple weeks. I talked about one yesterday. The LA Clippers traded Kawhi Leonard to the Toronto Raptors, a place that he won the NBA Finals back in 2019. I gave my thoughts on that trade yesterday. I'm going to give some more thoughts today on that trade, the LaMelo Ball trade to the Minnesota Timberwolves, the Giannis Antetokounmpo trade to the Miami Heat, along with the Ja Morant trade to the Portland Trail Blazers. I'll give my thoughts on all of those trades at the end, but I'm going to start out talking about the MLB. A big headline over the last week was Carlos Mendoza, manager of the New Yrok Mets, was fired. And the Mets have not done much better since Mendoza was fired on June 26th. They had a horrific play to start their game on Monday night against the Toronto Blue Jays, which there was an inside-the-park Little League home run for George Springer. It was ended up being scored in the scorebook as a triple in an error by A.J. Ewing, who is the center fielder for the New Yrok Mets that night, which led to Springer scoring on that play rather than just being a triple. He ended up scoring since Ewing tried to pick it up and then lost the ball, and that ended up being an inside-the-park home run. As I said, it goes in the scorebook as a triple, and then an error by Ewing. But if you just look at the scorebook, you would think Ewing was the only person that made a mistake on that play, but that's not the case. Juan Soto missed a ball that ended up getting by him, and then rather than hustling and getting to the wall, he kind of looked like he was just letting Ewing come in from center field to get that ball and try to make a play on it. Ewing probably had a better angle at that point, but still, I would have loved to have seen a little bit more effort from Soto on that play. Regardless, it ends up being an inside-the-park home run. As I said, went in the scorebook as a triple, and then an error by Ewing, but Springer ended up scoring on that play regardless. And then later in that game, Ronnie Mauricio of the New Yrok Mets hit Francisco Alvarez, his teammate, with the bat in the on-deck circle. It was by accident. He was trying to swing and get ready for his plate appearance that was coming up right at the start of that inning. And Alvarez was just too close to him, and Alvarez probably should know better not be that close. But regardless, there's no other way to put it. The Mets are a disaster right now, and they are 2-8 over the last 10 games, 7-13 over the last 20. Both of those records are tied for the worst overall in both of those splits, and they currently have a .419 win percentage on the season, which is fifth worst in the MLB. Mendoza finished the 2026 season with a 34-47 record and finished his Mets tenure overall with a record of 206 and 199, so a .509 win percentage. The Mets did make the NLCS in 2024, his first year at the helm, which is really impressive. But they missed the playoffs in 2025 and are likely going to miss the playoffs again in 2026, the way things stand right now. And that leaves the question, can the Mets turn things around? Honestly, the way things look right now, I would say no. It's unfortunate because this is a team I had very high expectations for heading into the season, even with the major turnover they had in the offseason, an offseason that saw Pete Alonso, Brandon Nimmo, Jeff McNeil, and Edwin Diaz all depart from Queens. That was a lot of turnover, but I still had a lot of promise around this team and thought they had a lot of potential because you added Bo Bichette, Jorge Polanco, who's one of the best players in the MLB playoffs last year. Also adding in Freddie Peralta, Luis Robert Jr., Marcus Semien, and Semien I wasn't that high on. I thought the best part of his career was already over with, but regardless, they had a lot of additions this offseason. I thought they recovered well from those guys leaving. But right now, this team is at rock bottom. A lineup with Bo Bichette, Francisco Lindor, and Juan Soto, averaging just 4 runs per game, which is tied for third worst in the MLB, is disappointing. And I know they've had injuries to important players, but they're not showing any promise right now that they're going to turn things around. They've continued to struggle all year, and with that being said, it is a long season. But currently, they are right now 10 games out of the NL wildcard and have a 36-50 record. I think the season is over for them, sadly. And that's tough to say. I was rooting for the Mets. I saw them play earlier this season in a game in the end of March. Saw them in their second home game of the year have a walk-off win at home against the Pittsburgh Pirates, which was an exciting game to be at. I thought Citi Field was a beautiful ballpark. I thought the energy from the fan base was awesome. And even with it being a cold day where it was frigid with a ton of wind, being there for a walk-off win was special, especially in extra innings. So I was rooting for the Mets, which at the end of the day, as I said, the season is not over, but you look back and you reflect on how this year has gone, and they really have continued to struggle all year. And I listened to the show today, which is a podcast between Joel Sherman and John Heyman, and they had Steve Cohen, the Mets owner, on their podcast today. Listened to that earlier, and you could hear Steve Cohen and his disappointment in this year's team. But he also noted that at the end of the day, they did have a lot of moving parts, and sometimes it looks better on paper than when you get on the field. And that's the reality of things. Obviously, a lot of turnover can be sometimes a good thing, but at the same time, when you're losing a lot of the core players that were fan favorites like Pete Alonso and Jeff McNeil, it's tough to make up that team culture, especially in one offseason. And the Mets, I thought, had a strong offseason, and now you look at their roster and their struggles, and you could see that maybe they had more work to do than people expected, than I expected as well, which Steve Cohen did note as well that he thinks things are better between Juan Soto and Francisco Lindor now. And just saying that insinuates that there were issues in the past between the two. I know there were reports last year that they didn't get along. And I think Cohen's saying today that they're getting along more now, in that headline is more of last year's news. That kind of tells you that there were issues between them last year, that validates Lindor and Soto did not have the best relationship. And who knows if that's still the case. I know that's just all reports, and I'm not in that locker room, so I wouldn't know. But it is concerning when your two star players aren't getting along. Hopefully that ends up not being the case, and I'm hoping the Mets turn things around. But the way things stand right now at 36-50, it seems like it's going to be a tough feat for them to try to make the playoffs. Now I'm going to move on and talk about the Boston Red Sox, who started to catch fire over the weekend, winning 4 games out of 4 against the New York Yankees, a 4-game sweep from last Thursday night to Sunday night on Sunday Night Baseball on NBC. Before last night's loss to the Nationals, the Red Sox won 5 in a row, which was great to see, and that's something the Red Sox needed to do, was to try to string some wins together, and they were doing that, before last night's loss. The Red Sox starting pitching has been nothing short of elite lately, and honestly, for most of the season, it's been the Red Sox' most consistent strength. And heading into last night, the Red Sox had 12 consecutive quality starts, which was too shy of the franchise record of 14 back in 1988. And over that 12-game stretch, the Red Sox starting pitchers had a 1.75 ERA with a 6-1 record. Unfortunately, that streak did end last night with starting pitcher Connolly Early only going 4 innings and exiting the game with left elbow inflammation. He is now on the IL, which is very disappointing to see considering how much promise he has. He's a great young pitcher, and every night when he's out there, it's exciting and fun to watch. Unfortunately, he's now on the IL, and I know the Red Sox would definitely miss him in their starting rotation. In the Red Sox-Yankees series from this past weekend, the Red Sox got wins against Cam Schlittler, even though he had no earned runs in that game, Will Warren, Garrett Cole, and Carlos Rodon. They outscored the Yankees 21-9 in that series and held the Yankees to just 17 hits and a 4-for-24 total with runners in scoring position, which is really impressive. The Yankees were only 4-for-24 with runners in scoring position. On Friday night, Peyton Toley had a perfect game through 5 innings. And then on Sunday Night Baseball, Sonny Gray carried a no-hitter through 7 1/3 innings. And in that game on Sunday night, the Red Sox nearly lost that game, and the Yankees ended up tying the game at 2-2 in the top of the 9th. The Red Sox allowed 2 runs in the top of the 10th before the Sox recovered and bounced back, scoring 3 runs in the bottom of the 10th inning, thanks to a big single from Anthony Siegler, a pinch hit double from Masataka Yoshida, and a game-winning single from Jarren Duran to give the Red Sox their first 4-game sweep of the Yankees since 2018. Now the question around the Yankees is, should the Yankees be worried right now? Which the Yankees have now lost 4 in a row to Boston, lost 2 in a row now to Detroit, and are currently losing today to the Detroit Tigers, which would be a 3-game sweep for Detroit if Detroit is able to win today's game. And I listen to WFAN radio pretty often. I know a lot of Yankees fans are worried about this current stretch. They had a tough June. But I don't think the Yankees should be too worried. I know they struggled in June, and they ended up finishing June with a record of 12-14. But at the end of the day, they do have a lot of injuries right now to Aaron Judge, Giancarlo Stanton, Trent Grisham, Max Fried. Jazz Chisholm even missed a game with potential concussion. Considering how weak the American League is, the Yankees will still be a playoff team, barring a generational collapse. And the injuries to Stanton and Judge have been detrimental. And I think that's why Ben Rice has been struggling a little bit as of late. He finished June with a 196 batting average, 6 home runs, 10 RBIs, a 382 slugging percentage, and a 657 OPS. I think he's been struggling a little bit as of late because the offense is relying on him heavily due to the injuries to Judge and Stanton. I think at some point the Yankees will bounce back. We'll see what happens. It's a long baseball season, and you're going to have some good stretches and bad stretches, especially over a 162-game period. You're not going to be great every single night. You're going to have a bad night. The bat's going to get cold. The pitching is going to struggle. That just happens in a baseball season. That's why the baseball season is as long as it is, because the best teams are usually the best teams record-wise after 162 games. So we'll see what happens with the Yankees. I don't think they should be too worried as of now. As for the Red Sox, though, one guy I want to highlight is Caleb Durbin, who in his last 28 games heading into last night, he hit .330 over that 30-game stretch with a .620 slugging percentage, a .975 OPS, 6 home runs, 19 runs batted in, and 5 stolen bases. He's been the Red Sox's best player next to Wills Contreras over the last month. Offensively, those two have been the best players, which is great to see because the offense has needed someone to pick them up with some bats struggling and then some injuries to players like Marcelo Meyer and Roman Anthony. It's great to see Caleb Durbin's back getting hot. He's been great for the Sox as of late. Now I want to move on to talk about the Angels, who recently fired their general manager last Friday night. Perry Minasian is no longer the GM of the Angels. They now have an interim general manager, and that is John Mozeliak, who spent a lot of his career with the St. Louis Cardinals. And Minasian, in his tenure with the Angels, finished with a record of .392 and .500. So 392 wins and 500 losses. The Angels went 77 and 85 in 2021. That was his first year at the helm. 73 and 89 in 2022. The same record in 2023 as well, 73 and 89. 63 and 99 in 2024. 72 and 90 in 2025. And then they were 34 and 48 before firing him before last Friday night's game ended. So a combined record of .392 and 500. Alden Gonzalez of ESPN pointed out that, and this is an article he wrote for ESPN last week, that since Minasian took over at the start of 2021, the Angels sport the 6th lowest win percentage in baseball. They've scored the 8th fewest runs, and they've also put up the 5th highest ERA in the major leagues, all while possessing a farm system that consistently has been rated among the worst in the industry. And that's the end of the quote there. But Minasian has had some good draft picks, including Zach Neto, Nolan Schanuel, Logan O'Hoppe. The issue with the Angels farm system is that they often rush prospects through the minor leagues to try to help them at the major league level, more in the current moment than thinking in the future. And that hurts the development of those players, and that could be part of the reason for some of those players' struggles at the major league level. And I know a lot of people are going to look back at the 2023 MLB trade deadline when Shohei Ohtani was a hot commodity on the trade market, and the Angels decide to roll with him rather than trade him. And at the end of the day, looking back at that, the Angels were only 3 games out of a wild card at that point. And Shohei Ohtani did let the franchise know that he wanted to stay with the team through the rest of the season. He was trying to believe that they could make a legitimate run in the playoffs. At the time, they were only 3 games back of the wild card at that trade deadline in 2023. I think they were 4.5 games back in their division lead at that point as well. So they made decisions at that deadline to hold Shohei Ohtani and try to add to that team, including making a trade for Lucas Giolito, also making a trade for C.J. Cron and Randall Grichuk. And at the end of the day, those trades did not work out for the Angels. They ended up struggling at the end of that season, missing the playoffs. And at the end of the day, people are going to look back and say, well, you should have traded Shohei Ohtani. He wanted to stay with the franchise through the end of that season. And when you have the best player in the game of baseball on your team and he says, I want to stay through the end of the year, it's hard to trade him at that point. And I think the Angels knew that he was going to be obviously highly regarded in free agency. And if you trade Shohei at that deadline, you probably have no chance at him in free agency. So they gambled. We're hoping to get him back in free agency by keeping him through the end of that season. And maybe they make a run in the playoffs where Shohei is more intrigued by whatever offer they gave in free agency. Ultimately, that ends up not being the case. They end up missing the playoffs, and everybody knows Shohei goes to the Dodgers, and now they've won back-to-back World Series since they added him in free agency. But I think Minasian's made some good moves, obviously had some tough ones. I think when you step into a role and you have one of the highest paid players in the game of baseball, and Anthony Rendon, in your roster, and he's missing a lot of games due to injuries, it's tough. And he tried to make some other moves as well that didn't work out, including, like I mentioned, trading for Lucas Giolito at that trade deadline and Randall Grigic. That didn't work out, and they've tried to make some other moves as well, recently even adding in a guy like Jorge Soler, who has struggled for them over the last couple seasons. So that's the end of the Minasian tenure as the GM of the Angels. I expect the Angels to trade and be sellers at the deadline. I expect teams to go after Reed Detmers. I expect teams to be interested in Mike Trout as well. We'll see what they do, but I do expect that team to be a seller at the deadline. So now I'm going to talk about the NBA draft, which happened a week ago. A.J. Debinson was drafted first overall to the Washington Wizards. This was not a shock and was the right move by the Wizards. A.J. is a special player and is a great addition to a lineup that includes Trae Young, Keyshawn George, Anthony Davis, and Alex Sarr. The Wizards are going to surprise some people next year and are going to be a playoff team in the East. A.J. has elite potential, and I think will be an all-NBA player in year one. I know that's very much a hot take, and I recognize that it's a hot take, but I think Debinson is a very special player, and he can alter the direction of a franchise within 1 year. I think with A.J. Debinson, this team is a playoff team next year. We'll see what happens, but I think Washington got it right, taking him at number 1. At number 2, Darren Peterson was selected by the Utah Jazz. I thought the Jazz would go for Cam Boozer here since his father, Carlos, works in Utah's front office. But at the time, it would not have made the most sense for the Jazz to take Boozer with their current big man rotation, which now has changed. But at the time, at the NBA draft, the Jazz had Walker Kessler, they had Jaren Jackson Jr. and Lauri Markkanen, so it didn't make the most sense at that point to take Cam Boozer. But at the same time, in the NBA draft, a lot of the time you have to draft for best player available. You don't really draft for need always. And if the Jazz thought Boozer was the best player there at number 2, they probably would have taken him, but they went and they took Darren Peterson. And now their big man rotation has changed. They traded Walker Kessler today to the Los Angeles Lakers, and they drafted Darren Peterson at number 2. Peterson is a true bucket getter, although the injuries were reportedly a major concern to a lot of executives. If Peterson could live up to his ceiling, Keontae George and Peterson could be an electrifying scoring duo. We'll see what ends up happening, but they took him at number 2. I wasn't the highest on Peterson as I was Caleb Wilson. I thought Caleb Wilson was the second best prospect in this draft. So if I were the Utah Jazz, I would have taken Caleb Wilson at 2, but they end up going and taking Darren Peterson. And now they have a duo in their backcourt of Keontae George and Darren Peterson, and also Ace Bailey, who is, I think, a tremendous athlete. And a player who I think is underrated after a good rookie season. He didn't really get as much hype as some of the other rookies, such as Cooper Flagg, Con Knippel, Dylan Hopper, VJ Edgecombe. But I think Ace Bailey had a really good rookie year. He's a guy that I'm very, very high on. My confidence in him has not wavered at all. I think that Utah team is going to be really good next year. I'll talk about them a little bit more when I talk about that Walker Kessler trade. Now moving on to number 3, Cam Boozer to the Memphis Grizzlies. This was not a surprise here. As I said before, I think Boozer is a very consistent player and he does a lot of things well, but he's not very flashy, which is why I was not as high on him as Debinson or Caleb Wilson. I think Wilson's ceiling is higher than Boozer, but I think Wilson's floor is also lower than Cam Boozer's. So I do understand why Memphis went with him here at number 3. At number 4, the Chicago Bulls cashed in, and they took Caleb Wilson here with the 4th overall pick. Wilson, I think, is the second best prospect in the draft. To land him at number 4 and then follow it up with Dalen Swain at 15 is an absolute home run of a draft for the Chicago Bulls front office. Wilson is going to be a highlight machine and is an athletic big who will be a key playmaker on each end of the floor here for Chicago. He gets downhill well, finishes at the rim when slashing, and cleans up the glass on the offensive and defensive ends. I love this pick here at number 4 for the Bulls. And then at number 5, the Keaton Waddle pick here for the LA Clippers. He has good size. He's a 6'6" combo guard who has great range from 3, which the Clippers do need. And I know he was an under-the-radar prospect from high school to college, but he proved he can be an elite player at the college level. To have the 5th overall pick here was a gift for the Clippers. They acquired this in the Ivica Zubac trade to the Indiana Pacers. So I was fine with taking whoever the Clippers wanted to take here at number 5, especially in a stacked draft. You really can't go wrong. Waddle has high basketball IQ. He will definitely build some muscle to help him at the NBA level, which I think is going to help him on each end of the floor. And he's a really good shooter, which the Clippers need. He could fit well next to Darius Garland, which the Clippers must have envisioned here when they drafted him at number 5. Now for my favorite picks from day one, and one of them I've already mentioned, Caleb Wilson going number 4 to Chicago. I think he has superstar potential, and I think Chicago got it right with that pick. At number 7, I love the Michael Brown Jr. pick to the Brooklyn Nets. I know he has injury concerns, but considering he fell all the way to number 7, and he has a ton of potential to be an offensive threat as a 3-level scorer at the next level, that is a great pick there for the Brooklyn Nets, a team that's looking for a player to build around. I think they could have that there with Brown at number 7. I love the number 15 pick, which was the Chicago Bulls taking Dalen Swain, who has a ton of offensive potential. He's a very good defender, which I think is obviously something that the Bulls value, but they also need more scoring on that team. They need a guy that gets downhill, and that's what Dalen Swain could do. He can get downhill, he can score the ball in the mid-range, and he's also a very good athlete. This was a great pick there at number 15 for the Bulls. I'm excited to see what he does there, and I think he might have been the biggest sleeper here in the NBA draft. I love Dalen Swain here going number 15 to the Bulls. Another sleeper pick here is Cameron Carr going number 24 to the LA Lakers. They add a great athlete who can be a 3-level scorer at the next level. He's excellent in transition, brings a lot of athleticism to that lineup. I really like that pick there for the Lakers. And then my favorite picks from day 2, Malik Thomas at number 34 to the Cleveland Cavaliers is a great pickup. They need more scoring off that bench. Malik Thomas is going to be able to provide that. He's an absolute bucket. I really liked the pick by the LA Clippers at number 36. They got Baba Miller, a forward out of Cincinnati. He has a ton of athleticism, can be the exact power forward that the Clippers need. And I remember looking at the best prospects available heading into day 2 last week, and I remember seeing his name, watching some of his highlights, and I was like, that's the guy I want at number 36. And then the Clippers delivered. Lawrence Frank took him at the 36th overall pick, which he can be a very good defender and a rebounder for the Clippers and can be excellent in transition because he can jump out the gym. He's also very versatile defensively. I think he can probably cover 1 through 4, which is really good, and that's something the Clippers need. So I'm really excited with that pick there. I think he can be a very good rotation player for the Clippers next year and end up being a potential star for the future for the Clips. I could be wrong there, but I do think he has a lot of potential. And then I would say my other favorite pick from day 2 is number 52 overall, and that was Andre Visar, who was taken by the Atlanta Hawks. They need a big man that can shoot the ball from 3, and they end up getting that there. And that's a very good depth piece for them off their bench, especially a player that fell all the way to 52. And it was interesting why he fell. I guess it was because he wanted a guaranteed standard contract and didn't want it to be a 2-way deal. And Atlanta was willing to give him a standard contract, supposedly. At least that's what reports were saying on draft night. And he ends up going at number 52 overall, which is a very good pickup there for the Atlanta Hawks. Now I'm going to move on to talk about some trades in the NBA. And I'll start out with the trade rumor around Jaylen Brown. After shopping him for Giannis Antetokounmpo, Boston is now in a weird spot where they probably wouldn't want to trade Jaylen Brown unless they have to, but it seems like their relationship and their bond is completely broken, and I'm not sure if it's something they could repair. And at the end of the day, I think they're going to trade him this summer, possibly very soon. I don't think that's a hot take. I think a lot of people would agree with me that Jaylen Brown will be traded at some point. I don't think the Celtics can shop him for yet another summer in pursuit of a big name. We've seen in the past the Celtics were interested in Kawhi Leonard, Jimmy Butler, Anthony Davis, Damian Lillard, most recently Giannis Antetokounmpo. And it's tough to be shopping him year in and year out and act like all is well. And I think JB feels disrespected by this. And at the same time, I've said for years that I don't think Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum have the best relationship. In my opinion, I think they tolerate one another. And I could be completely wrong, but I just don't think they're as good of friends as they've tried to make it seem like in the past. I feel like Brad Stevens and the Celtics are going to choose to build around Jason Tatum, and in that case, trade Jaylen Brown. JB has been in the headlines this offseason for saying that this past season was his favorite year of his career, which a lot of fans were upset about, and potentially maybe the Celtics front office was upset by it too, since they were first-round exit against the Philadelphia 76ers, losing a 3-1 series lead. But I don't think you could shop Jaylen Brown for yet another offseason and then just keep him on your roster next year and act like all is well. I think this will be it for Jaylen Brown in Boston. I think he ends up being traded some point soon. Now I'm going to move on to talk about a trade that went down yesterday that I've already spoke about, but I want to give some more thoughts, and that was Kawhi Leonard being traded from the LA Clippers to the Toronto Raptors. In this deal, the Clippers received Brandon Ingram, Grady Dick, a 2031 unprotected first-round pick, a 2033 unprotected first-round pick, a 2027 first-round pick swap, and second-round picks in 2030 and 2033. The Clippers now own 9 future first-round picks, and 9 future second-round picks as well, which is something the Clippers have never had during the time that I've been a fan of theirs. They've never had this much draft capital. And as I said yesterday, I became a fan of this team because of Paul George. And now I'm in it for the long haul. I'll be staying with the Clippers no matter what, even as they approach a youth movement and are embracing a rebuild or a retooling era. I'm staying with the Clippers through it all. But to be able to pivot in the matter of 5 months and move Ivica Zubac, James Harden, and Kawhi Leonard, while adding as much draft capital as the Clippers have in young players, it's been really impressive. And they turned James Harden, Kawhi Leonard, Ivica Zubac, and Kobe Brown into Darius Garland, Benedict Mathurin, who's now a free agent, Isaiah Jackson, Brandon Ingram, Grady Dick, along with 4 second-round picks and 6 first-round picks, along with the 5th overall pick in the 2026 NBA draft, who the Clippers ended up drafting Keaton Wagler out of Illinois, who has a lot of promise and I think was a good pick by the Clippers, even though I did prefer Michael Brown Jr., but all in all, at the end of the day, to have the 5th overall pick in a draft where at one point you wouldn't have had any draft pick if you didn't decide to trade Ivica Zubac was a treat for the Clippers. And it makes you think, what would have happened if James Harden didn't look to get an extension midseason this past year from the Clippers? Had the Clippers decided to give him an extension, they probably would have kept James Harden. They probably would have extended Kawhi Leonard, and they probably would have kept Ivica Zubac as well. And I think they would have been in a much different position. They went from being a team without much future draft capital and had kind of a daunting future to having a ton of future draft assets and young players to try to build around, which is very good for the Clippers. So at the end of the day, that turning point from going from trying to contend in a tough Western Conference while knowing that this was not going to be the year in the 25-26 season to completely flipping things mid-season, trading Zoo, trading Kobe Brown, trading James Harden, and now trading Kawhi Leonard this offseason, to pivoting and now having a much better and brighter future to build around, which now they have Brandon Ingram on their team as well, who I think is a very good bucket getter, but I do not think he is part of the Clippers' future. So I expect them to trade him down the line, whether it's this season, maybe mid-season, whatever it may be. He currently has 2 years remaining at $80 total million, so around $40 million in each season. He does have a player option for the 2027-2028 season, so that second year is not necessarily guaranteed. He averaged 21 points, 6 rebounds, and 4 assists for Toronto last year, and is still only 28 years old. I think he's a very good player, but I don't think he's part of the future for the Clippers. I think they would rather build around Darius Garland, and I expect them to maybe potentially move Brandon Ingram for future assets down the line. We've seen a lot of teams do this, teams that are in a rebuild get better by trading those players that have a lot of value on the trade market and then taking whatever they get in return and then flipping some of that for more assets. We've seen the Oklahoma City Thunder do it. We've seen the Brooklyn Nets try to do it. And now we see the LA Clippers potentially try to do that. I do think they try to flip Brandon Ingram for more assets down the line. They did get Grady Dick in this deal, who was great in year 2 in the NBA, which was in the 2024-2025 season, where he averaged 14 points, 4 rebounds, and 2 assists. But in this past season, in the 2025-2026 season, he made just 1 start in 76 games. And in that stretch, he saw his field goal attempts per game fall from 12 in year 2 to just 4 field goal attempts per game in year 3, along with his minutes per game being cut in half from 29 to 14 from year 2 to year 3. He's still only 22 years old, and I think he'd be a good bench scorer for the Clippers. I think he has a little more value than people expect. But now just to reflect on Kawhi's tenure in LA, the Clippers finished with just 3 playoff series, won during the 7 seasons that Kawhi Leonard was on the roster, with the highlight being a 2021 Western Conference Finals loss. That ends up being the first time the Clippers ever made it to the conference finals in their franchise history. So that was a bright spot from the Kawhi Leonard era. And there were some other bright spots as well. Another highlight being during that 2-13 era, the Clippers had a 26-5 stretch in the 2023-2024 NBA season. And over that 26-5 stretch, we saw the Clippers thrive with a lineup that included Russell Westbrook, Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, James Harden, Norman Powell, Ivica Zubac. The Clippers were finding ways to win on a nightly basis because of that talent level they had on that team, and it was exciting basketball to watch. And another highlight from that given season was in January of 2024. There was a game that the Clippers visited the TD Garden. And in that game, at one point, the Clippers had a 36-point lead. They ended up winning that game by 19 points. And when you look back at the start of the 213 era, there was so much promise. And was it a major gamble by LA to trade 5 first-round picks and 2 first-round pick swaps to Oklahoma City Thunder in a trade package that also included Shai Gilgeous-Alexander? Definitely. It was a major gamble. But the Clippers front office rolled the dice, and they made the move with the intention of winning a ring. A ring with the reigning Finals MVP from the 2019 season in Kawhi Leonard, and a top 3 MVP candidate from that same season, the 2018-2019 season, in Paul George. You can't blame or fault the Clippers for trying to go all in, and at the end of the day, it made sense why they did so. They saw a duo that they could pair together, that they saw them winning at least 1, maybe 2 rings with those 2 guys on their roster. And it's disappointing to see the way things went, but at the end of the day, I would not be an LA Clippers fan had they not made that trade for Paul George. And as I said, for the first couple seasons, Paul George was on the LA Clippers. I just watched kind of casually just because I like Paul George, and obviously Kawhi Leonard is an electrifying player as well. But it was that 2021 playoff run where I became a Clippers fan, where I was watching on a nightly basis, not because of just Paul George, but because I became a fan of that team. And then it was the start of that 2021-2022 season where I became a Clippers fan and only a Clippers fan. And at the end of the day, I'm going to stay with them through it all. And like I said, people are going to look back at this era and say it was a failure overall because they didn't bring back a ring. And I understand that. I understand they did not bring back a ring, and in that regard, it is a failure. But I don't want that idea of it being a failure from overshadowing all the bright moments there were over that era, which I know ultimately the Clippers want to win a ring, and that was their goal, and that's what every fan wants. That's an LA Clippers fan. That's what everybody in the Clippers front office wanted. That's what their coaching staff wanted. That's what every player on their roster wanted over the 213 era. And sadly, they weren't able to bring home a ring. But at the end of the day, had that trade not happened, I wouldn't be an LA Clippers fan. If the Paul George trade did not happen, I would not be an LA Clippers fan. And at the same time as well, like I said, there were a lot of bright moments over that stretch that Kawhi Leonard and Paul George were LA Clippers. And if you look back at this past season, the Clippers were 6-21 at one point, and I completely gave up on this past season. And then Kawhi Leonard averaged 28 points per game, and the Clippers finished the season with a 42-40 record, which is a major positive considering the way they started the season, and they also pivoted mid-season from being a team trying to make the playoffs after a 6-21 start to retooling and trading Ivica Zubac and trading James Harden, and they recovered from that because of Benedict Mathurin, Darius Garland being really good for them, Kawhi Leonard being terrific and was the best player on the floor most nights in any given game. And I consider that 2025-2026 season, even though it didn't end up with the Clippers making the playoffs, they lost in the play-in tournament to the Golden State Warriors, I consider that a bright note in the Kawhi Leonard era because, first off, it signaled the Clippers need to go in a different direction, which they ended up doing, and now they obviously have a much brighter future. But secondly, when you start the year 6-21 and you come into the year with so many high expectations, Bradley Beal was an absolute miss for the LA Clippers, unfortunately, due to injury. John Collins didn't really find his footing until probably the second half of the season for the Clippers, which he was good kind of all year, but took limited shots. It wasn't really kind of gelling as well as I thought he would in that LA Clippers lineup. But by the end of the year, he was a very important player for the Clippers, and that's why, obviously, he got a good deal from the Detroit Pistons, 3 years, $51 million as a free agent today. But I had so many high expectations for this team heading into the year. A team that lost in the playoffs the year prior to Denver, and they did lose Norman Powell in free agency, but they added Bradley Beal last summer, which I thought was going to be a great player to replace Norman Powell. I was wrong there. Bradley Beal ended up only playing around 7 or 8 games for the LA Clippers before fracturing his hip, and he ended up missing the rest of the season. Brook Lopez was added last offseason. Chris Paul was added last offseason. So there was a lot of turnover for the Clippers last summer, and there were a lot of moving parts coming in. And going into the season, I had so many high expectations. And then when they started the year 6-21, and Bradley Beal was out for the season, and obviously Chris Paul had his issues, and he ended up being let go from the team, and he ends up retiring. I had so many high expectations for this team that I was shocked when they started the season 6-21, and I gave up on them. But to finish the year 42-40 ended up being a bright spot for the Clippers because they gave you fun basketball to watch in the second half of the season. And they did go on a run that I didn't see happening. But like I said, their goal was to win a championship with Paul George and Kawhi Leonard on their roster, and they ended up not being able to do so. So there were some valleys from the 2-13 era, and some of them being because of injury. In the 2020 season, the Clippers were the 2 seed in the Western Conference in the playoffs when the pandemic hit, and then the Clippers choked a 3-1 series lead in the bubble to the Denver Nuggets. 2021, the Clippers made the Western Conference Finals for the first time in franchise history, and they ended up losing to Phoenix. And in the series before that, in the Western Conference semifinals, Kawhi Leonard tore his ACL against the Utah Jazz. And obviously, if Kawhi Leonard's healthy, I think they end up beating the Phoenix Suns in that following playoff series in the Western Conference Finals. And then they'd be in the NBA Finals, and who knows what would happen after that. In 2023, Kawhi Leonard in the playoffs suffered a torn meniscus against the Phoenix Suns. And the Clippers end up losing that series in 5 games to Phoenix. 2024 playoffs. Kawhi Leonard was battling knee inflammation in the first-round series against Dallas, which limited him to just 2 games in that series. The Clippers ended up losing in 6 games to Dallas, who ended up making the NBA Finals. If Kawhi Leonard's healthy, who knows what that team would have been capable of with James Harden and Paul George all on that roster. In 2025, the LA Clippers lost in the playoffs to Denver last year. In a brutal 7-game series they could have won. Kawhi Leonard was healthy for that series. James Harden was healthy for that series, so injuries weren't necessarily the major factor there. But at the end of the day, they did make the playoffs consistently. They just never won playoff series and only won 3 overall in the 2-13 era, which the 2-13 era is Kawhi Leonard and Paul George's numbers, jersey numbers as LA Clippers. Kawhi was number 2. Paul George was 13. So that's why I refer to this era as 2-13. And now you look at where Kawhi Leonard's going. He's going to Toronto, where he was an All-Star and a second-team All-NBA selection back in the 2018-2019 season. He was also second-team All-Defense that year as well, and was the NBA Finals MVP and an NBA champion. And he's now joining a Raptors team that took the Cleveland Cavaliers to a 7-game series this past playoffs. If Kawhi Leonard's healthy, he's still a top 5 to 7 player in the NBA, in my opinion. So this is definitely a game-changing move for the Eastern Conference landscape. More than the Giannis Antetokounmpo trade, I would say, because I think the Raptors right now have a better roster around Kawhi Leonard than the Heat do around Giannis and Bam Adebayo. I think this Raptors team might be a better team right now, and that's why I think this is more of a game-changing trade for the Eastern Conference. Both teams there, though, Eric Spoelstra and Darko Rajakovic, are both great coaches, so I'm sure they're going to find ways to fit Giannis and Kawhi into their respective lineups, and we'll see what happens. But I think this Kawhi Leonard trade is a bigger move for Toronto than the Giannis trade was for the Miami Heat. And let me break down that trade now. I'll transition to that. So over the last couple weeks, the Miami Heat traded for Giannis Antetokounmpo and also got Bobby Portis in that deal. The Bucks, in return, got Tyler Hero, Khalil Ware, Jaime Jaquez Jr., Kasparis Yakachunas, along with a ton of draft picks, including 3 first-round picks, one being the 13th overall pick in the 2026 NBA Draft, which the Bucks ended up using on Nate Ament out of Tennessee, along with unprotected first-round picks from Miami in 2031 and in 2033, a first-round pick swap in 2030, and a 2033 second-round pick. That's a heavy price to pay for Miami. Now they lose a ton of depth in this trade. They also lose a young star in Khalil Ware, a promising young player in Yakachunas, and 3 first-round picks, along with the first-round pick swap. And with Giannis' heavy contract, the Miami Heat were unable to sign Norman Powell and re-sign him in free agency. He ended up leaving in free agency and signing today a 2-year, $45 million deal with the Chicago Bulls, which is a great addition for the Bulls. I've loved what they've done this offseason. This Heat roster is definitely talented. Giannis Antetokounmpo, Bam Adebayo, Andrew Wiggins, Davion Mitchell. This team still needs more shooting and they need more depth. I know they just added Tim Hardaway Jr., a player that I'm a fan of. He's definitely a good addition for their bench. But as of right now, I think this team is probably a 4 seed at best in the East, probably more of a 5 seed. This is a great return for Milwaukee at the end of the day, who is, I think, going to look to flip Tyler Hero as well at some point to fuel their rebuild even more, since I think he's unlikely to be part of their future plans. But if they do keep him, it's a cool story. Tyler Hero going back home to Milwaukee, and he's from Wisconsin, so it's cool having him back in his home state. I do understand why the Miami Heat did this trade. At the end of the day, when you can add Giannis Antetokounmpo, who I think is the best player in the NBA when he is healthy, I think he's the best player in the league, and I think he's the most dominant player in the league when he's healthy. I think it makes sense making this move, but at the same time, they did give up a lot of their depth. Jaquez, Ware, Yakachunas, Hero. Like, those are 4 very good rotation players with a ton of potential, especially Khalil Ware, a guy that I'm very high on, who I think is a future All-Star. That's a lot to give up. But I understand why they did it. It's an Eastern Conference that's pretty much open right now. I know the New York Knicks just won the NBA Finals, and most of their team is coming back, except they did lose Mitchell Robinson today to a 3-year, $51 million deal to the Boston Celtics, which Boston's been looking for a starting center since they got rid of Al Horford and Kristaps Porzingis an offseason ago. And now you look at Mitchell Robinson, he's probably going to be their starting big man if he's getting $17 million, and Neemias Queta's on still kind of a minimum contract. I think at the end of the day, that probably means a $17 million deal probably shows that the Celtics did want him as their starting big man. And Mitchell Robinson's a very good player. Arguably, any given night is the best defensive player on the floor. He's going to grab a lot of big-time rebounds for the Celtics, a lot of offensive rebounds for the Celtics. He was a key part of the New York Knicks winning the NBA Finals this year, and he was kind of the only guy that was there through their entire rebuild over the last 7 or 8 years, and ultimately leaves an NBA champion. But I think this signing for the Boston Celtics, which I know I'm getting a little bit off track here, but this signing for the Boston Celtics tells me that they're shifting away from the Mazzulla Ball strategy of just nonstop shooting threes. Because when you have Mitchell Robinson on the floor, he's not going to space the floor at all for you. He's not going to be out there shooting threes, and he's obviously going to struggle shooting free throws. I think this means the Celtics are changing their strategy a little bit, and that's something that Aiden Daly, James Daly, and I spoke about when I had them on my podcast a few weeks ago. We talked about that the Celtics kind of have to change the way they play the game because their reliance on threes hasn't really helped them in the last 2 playoff runs. They fell short to the New York Knicks a couple of years ago, and then this past playoff run fell short and lost to Philadelphia 76ers. And their strategy of shooting threes did help them win an NBA Finals back in 2024. So I understand why they did it. But this signing here of Mitchell Robinson tells me that the Celtics are going to shift away from that Mazzulla Ball focus at least a little bit. I don't think it's going to be as heavily reliant on shooting threes next year. We'll see what ends up happening. But the Eastern Conference, my point is pretty much open right now. You have the Indiana Pacers, who have Tyrese Halliburton coming back healthy, which will be fun to watch. You also have a Cleveland Cavaliers team who could potentially add LeBron James. The Miami Heat could potentially add LeBron James. So it's a pretty much wide open Eastern Conference right now. So that's why I think the Miami Heat made this move. And they still need to have a couple more moves to fill out the rest of that roster. And maybe I'd feel better about that roster with a little bit more depth. Another trade I want to mention is John Morant was traded to the Portland Trail Blazers. In this deal, the Blazers get John Morant, and the Grizzlies get Jeremy Grant and Chris Murray. It's pretty crazy when you look at it that John Morant did not net any draft pick in return here for the Memphis Grizzlies, which if somebody said to you 3 years ago that John Morant would be traded and it wouldn't be for any young player that, was a potential superstar and there were no draft picks involved in the trade, no one would have believed that 2 or 3 years ago. No one would believe that he would have such low trade value. But injuries, off-the-court issues, struggle shooting the ball over the last 3 years, which John Morant shot 23% from 3 this past season, and also a large contract. All of those factors have caused John Morant to be traded for minimal value. And the Grizzlies had no option but to move on from John Morant. They had no option at the end of the day. It was best for both sides, for Ja and the Grizzlies, to have a fresh start. And for the Grizzlies, adding Jeremy Grant is a good veteran player who can help Cam Boozer, Gigi Jackson, and Zach Edey develop more. And they may also look to trade him at some point. But I know his contract's around $35 million a year, which is pretty difficult considering if a team is looking to win the NBA Finals, they probably wouldn't want to take on that $35 million contract. We'll see what ends up happening. For the Blazers, though, this is a great buy low trade, and it's worth the roll of the dice for them because of how talented Ja Morant is. Considering that they did not have to trade any first-round pick in this trade is a major W. And if Ja Morant does not work out for Portland, there's not much holding them back from trading him or releasing him down the line. The Blazers now have a backcourt with Damian Lillard and Ja Morant in their starting lineup, and they still also have Drew Holiday, Shaedon Sharpe, and Scoot Henderson. I believe those last three guys I mentioned, Holiday, Sharpe, and Henderson, I don't believe all three of those players will be on their roster on opening night. I expect the Blazers to move at least one of them. And last Saturday, I was hanging out with some friends, and we were talking about the Jaylen Brown trade rumors, and I was putting together some trade candidates of players that the Celtics could look to trade Jaylen Brown for. And I put together a trade package of Drew Holiday, Shaedon Sharpe, and Scoot Henderson with a 2028 Milwaukee Bucks first-round pick and a 2028 Orlando Magic first-round pick in exchange for Jaylen Brown, which I still very much see the Portland Trail Blazers as a possibility for Jaylen Brown. And this was Saturday night. And then Sunday morning, a report comes out on Twitter that the Blazers were putting together a package centered around Scoot Henderson, Shaedon Sharpe, and draft compensation for Jaylen Brown, which is pretty crazy because it is the exact package I put together for Jaylen Brown the night before. And we'll see what ends up happening, but I expect the Blazers to move some of their depth to add another star to their lineup, which will include a lineup that has Damian Lillard, Ja Morant, Denny Avdia, and Donovan Clingan. And I think Shaedon Sharpe is an absolute stud. In the last 3 NBA seasons, he's averaged 16 points, 19 points, and 21 points, with the most recent year averaging 21 this past season. He has elite athleticism, is a strong bucket getter, and I think my hot take of the offseason is that Shaedon Sharpe, no matter where he is, will be an NBA All-Star next February. I think he's the most underrated player in the NBA. And if I were the Boston Celtics, I would love to get him in a trade for Jaylen Brown, if the Celtics decide ultimately to trade Jaylen Brown. Now moving on to another trade package, and that was LaMelo Ball being shipped to the Minnesota Timberwolves. In this deal, the Wolves got LaMelo Ball and Josh Green, and then the Hornets got Naz Reid, a 2033 unprotected first-round pick, 3 first-round pick swaps in 2028, 2029, and 2030, and 3 second-round picks. This trade was a massive haul for Charlotte. Yes, there is a chance that Minnesota has a better record in those 3 seasons, and Charlotte does not end up conveying the pick swap here. But still, it is tough to give up 3 years in 3 full seasons of control with draft swaps in the first round. And then also adding in a 2033 unprotected first-round pick. Obviously, I know some Hornets fans will be shocked by these moves. They traded Miles Bridges and LaMelo Ball in the same week. They must have seen those 2 guys as distractions, and they obviously end up moving on from them within days apart. I do think at the end of the day, a 2033 unprotected first-round pick has a lot of value because who knows what the Minnesota Timberwolves are going to look like down the line. And then the swaps in 28, 29, and 2030, people will just kind of push to the side and say, oh, they're first-round pick swaps, so who really cares? We're going to have a better record than them. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. But you never know, though. You never know how a season's going to pan out. Injuries obviously can play a role. Sometimes now with the new draft lottery, just the roll of the dice could be tough against you. So you really never know how things will pan out. And Anthony Edwards obviously has wanted more help, and now he has that. The Wolves' offense is going to be really strong. LaMelo Ball and Anthony Edwards kind of running the show. But I still don't think they're a better team than the Thunder or the Spurs. As for Charlotte, landing Naz Reid is a really good add here because he's a guy that can kind of transform your offense because he's a big man that can shoot threes. And I don't even think he's reached his full potential yet. He's now going to have a bigger role likely in Charlotte than he did in Minnesota. He's probably a guy that's going to have a really good year next season next to Brandon Miller and also Colin Kneppel. Now moving on to another trade, and that was a trade that happened today. Walker Kessler was dealt from the Utah Jazz to the Los Angeles Lakers in a massive trade. The Utah Jazz received 2031 and 2033 unprotected first-round picks, also adding in first-round pick swaps in 2028 and 2030. In this deal, Walker Kessler is going to the Lakers, and they are now giving him a 4-year, $130 million deal, along with $32.5 million per season over those 4 years, so $130 million overall. I think that's a heavy price to pay for the Lakers draft picks-wise. Kessler is a very good center and is still only 24 years old. He's a guy I was very high on a couple years ago. I thought he'd be a top 5 big man in the league. I think I said at one point maybe top 10, but I did have a very high expectation for him 2 or 3 years ago for the Jazz. Over the last 2 seasons, he's only played in 63 total games, including just 5 games this past season. He only played in 5 games since he missed the rest of the year with a torn labrum. He did average double-double, though, over those 63 games over the last 2 years. A really good player. And for the Lakers, this is a good get because they've been looking for a rim-protecting big man and tried to land Mark Williams in a trade in the past that ended up falling through. I understand why they did this, but I do just think it's a very hefty price to pay draft picks-wise, and it's a draft pick overpay in my opinion. Kessler has started to stretch the floor more and more over the last few years, starting to shoot more threes over the last year or two, and he's obviously going to be a lob threat for Luka Doncic, and he's also a strong defensive player. But Rob Pelinka just mortgaged the entire Lakers' future by giving up most of their draft pick control over the next 7 years. And that's something the Lakers were reluctant to do over the last couple of years. They were reluctant to trade many picks that far ahead. They would never trade a pick in 2033 like we just saw in this deal. And we also saw a 2031 unprotected first-round pick go in this deal. And those swaps, like I just mentioned in that past trade with Charlotte and Minnesota, the swaps are not something just to flip the page and forget about. Those swaps might end up being valuable. You never know how a team's going to play out. Charlotte, like I said, might end up having a better season down the line, let's say in 2028. And now they end up having the right to swap the Minnesota Timberwolves for a draft pick that's higher in the draft. They wouldn't have had that opportunity to do so if they didn't have that first-round pick swap. In this trade, the Lakers are giving up the right to swap picks with the Utah Jazz. You never know. Maybe the Utah Jazz in 2030 end up having a better record than the Los Angeles Lakers. It's really hard to predict how things are going to work out that far down the line. So that's why those picks have value. And the Lakers just mortgaged their whole future for this trade. I understand why they did it. There's not that many great young big men in the NBA that you could try to build around. So they're rolling the dice here on Walker Kessler. I just think it's too hefty of a price to pay draft picks-wise. And the Jazz didn't want to pay Walker Kessler since they had a fallback plan of having Lauri Markkanen and Jaren Jackson Jr. as their starting front court. So if things didn't work out with Walker Kessler in negotiations for an extension, they could have always moved him. And they obviously ended up taking that route and moving him. So to move him for the price that they got is exceptional. Credit to Danny Ainge. The Jazz are set up very well with a ton of young talent in Keontae George, Darren Peterson now, Ace Bailey, even Cody Williams, Bryce Sensabaugh, Isaiah Collier. Then you add in Markkanen and Jaren Jackson. This team is really set up to be really good over the next few seasons. And then even years down the line, because of the draft picks they have to work with and all of these young players, then they're going to continue to sprout and develop together. I would not be shocked if down the line they trade Lauri Markkanen to get another player and more draft picks that fit more with their timeline than Lauri Markkanen, which Markkanen's a great player. They're going to hold him for now, but I would not be shocked if down the line they flipped him for more picks and maybe a young player. Ace Bailey is a guy that I'm very high on. He finished his rookie year on a high note in his last 19 games. He averaged 19 points, 5 rebounds, 2 assists, and 2 stocks per game of 36% from 3. The Jazz, they're going to have a difficult time trying to figure out their starting lineup. Will Hardy is a great coach. They're going to have to really figure out if it's Darren Peterson or Ace Bailey as their starting shooting guard. I honestly think at the start of the season, they can both coexist in the same starting lineup, where you have Keontae George at point guard, Darren Peterson at shooting guard, Ace Bailey at small forward, Lauri Markkanen at power forward, and Jaren Jackson Jr. at center. We'll see what ends up happening. But I think Peterson and Bailey can play together. I think Ace Bailey has a ton of potential. And like I mentioned on my podcast episode with Aiden and James Daly, I think Ace Bailey's potential is through the roof. I still think he could be an all-NBA player. I still think he could be an MVP candidate down the line. He has a ton of potential and can really jump out the gym, really can attack the rim, and is also good defensively. So I am really high on Ace Bailey. I do think he's a guy that was underrated as a rookie this past season, and that's because there were a lot of good rookies, VJ Edgecombe being one, Cooper Flagg, Con Kneppel, Dylan Hopper. There were a lot of good rookies in the NBA this past season. So now the last topic I'm going to talk about is LeBron James. He notified the Lakers yesterday that he plans on playing elsewhere in the upcoming season, marking the end of his time as a Laker, an era that spanned 8 years and brought LA a championship back in 2020, along with LeBron James receiving 7 All-NBA selections over those 8 years. This is something I expected to happen. Back in April, I said LeBron would walk to Golden State in free agency to team up with Steph Curry, which is still very much a possibility. LeBron could follow Kawhi Leonard's lead, though, and go on a reunion tour. He is in talks right now with the Cleveland Cavaliers and Miami Heat. Would not be shocked if he went to one of those two destinations, but I am expecting him to go play with Steph Curry on the Golden State Warriors. We saw Draymond Green opt out of his player option this week. That frees up around $27 million on the salary cap there for the Warriors. Maybe Draymond and LeBron end up taking veteran minimums to try to play together for a season. We'll see what ends up happening, but at some point down the line, LeBron James is going to sign with a new team. This NBA offseason has been wild already. We've already seen LaMelo Ball, Giannis Antetokounmpo, Kawhi Leonard, John Morant, all traded. Added Walker Kessler today getting moved. We'll likely see Jaylen Brown traded at some point. And we're going to see LeBron James walk in free agency to a new team. There's also an outside chance we see the Detroit Pistons trade Jalen Duren in a sign-and-trade move. It's been a great offseason already for the NBA. A lot of shakeup and a lot of new faces in new places. We'll see how things work out, but I'm excited to see what the rest of the offseason holds. We're very early on in free agency, and there's still obviously a lot of trades that could happen. So I'm excited to see how things unfold. But anyways, that'll wrap up this episode. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to this. As always, I appreciate it. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you.